Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
I think the more you build things for other people, the more happy you'll be.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Measuring Success Right. My name is Jake Conlin, and I'll be your host today. Today, I'm joined by Professor Matthew Jennejohn. Professor Jennejohn is a professor of law here at the J. Rueben Clark Law School. He also serves on the board for the Association of American Law Schools and taught as a visiting professor at the Columbia Law School. Prior to teaching at BYU, Professor Jennejohn was an associate at Shearman and Sterling in New York and a law clerk in Delaware and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Before that, he served as vice president of the Self-Reliance Foundation in Mozambique. Professor Jennejohn is a graduate of Columbia Law School, the London School of Economics, and Brigham Young University. His research on the relationship between legal institutions and equitable economic growth has been published in top journals including the Stanford Law Review, Northwestern Law Review, and the Georgetown Law Journal. Dr. Jennejohn, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
No, thanks for having me. This is an honor.
Okay, well, to start things off, as I visited your website, I read a story about your childhood in Wisconsin that led you to study your specific fields of law. Could you share that story with our audience?
Yeah. So I was born in Wisconsin, grew up in Wisconsin, and in sort of a standard, typical middle-class family. My dad was a financial controller at a local hospital. And then, it's sort of a lengthy story, but basically when I was 11 years old, he was diagnosed with cancer at an extremely young age. He was barely 40 years old. And that process, he also lost his job at the same time, and he then fought cancer for 13 more years. And that sort of introduced us to economic precarity and experiencing what it's like in the United States to try to make a go of things in those sort of circumstances. And I think I'm probably not unusual in trying to move beyond that story through college and graduate school. And as time has gone on, however, I've often just reflected on it, and it's become an important motivation for me as I've thought about my research, like what am I trying to do with my professional life? And just the experiences that I had and my family had trying to get through that time has turned out to be really meaningful. So there were difficult experiences. I'm trying to remember my own website, but I think I just mentioned some of the. There's a great deal of shame that comes with economic hardship in the United States.
Yeah.
And I got a taste of that. And then there were also things where either formal institutions like state and local government in Wisconsin, and programs like food stamps and meals at school, and financial assistance for education helped, and also informal relationships, friends, church community, family. Both of those sides of the coin, I think, made a big difference in my life, and that's one of the things that I keep coming back to as I try to set my goals and try to make a difference.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that happened to you, but it does sound like that experience has become a really big motivator in your life, which kind of leads me to my next question. I read on your website that you are trying to create a world where your son's creativity has room to wander. Could you describe some of your research on creating this world and on building equitable institutions for a complex economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I shared that I just mentioned that a bit on my personal website, just because as I've also thought about things and what exactly is the end goal of not only my own research, but what sort of goal as a society should we be embracing? It's a really difficult question to think about, especially on the collective level, where agreement is so difficult. But I've often come back to this idea of promoting creativity, and a life well led is a creative life, because I think, at least for myself, that's been a source of lasting happiness and fulfillment, and that we could all have that opportunity. And I think there's a lot of inputs to that, and one of them is having an economic system that supports you to an extent that you have that freedom, and also can create opportunities for you to do that. So connecting that to my research is something that I'm always working on doing. And the reason it's a great question, Jake, but it's also a difficult one in the sense that we operate in an incredibly complex economy. And I think part of being a professor and a researcher is really trying to tangle with that complexity and try to, beat through the bushes to try to create a path for people to achieve that creative life that they want. So what I focus on is how certain types of legal institutions, mostly within what we call private law. So I don't focus on constitutional law or things like that, but really the fundamental building blocks of the economy. So that's property rights, contractual rights, forms of economic organization like corporations and all their different varieties. How those are combined and then also sort of taken apart and recombined in different situations from market to market, from one time period to the next, to try to support people in that creative process. So I think it's easy to focus on sort of the the headline type people in that story. So we could use a sort of a character like, how does Elon Musk use the legal system to create new things, whether it's SpaceX or Tesla, and that's part of the story. And I think what's also interesting though is to think about, well, how do less visible parts of society use the system? Is it working for them? Is it actually creating obstacles for them? If you're not Elon Musk, if you're a student at BYU, if you are, a citizen in West Jordan, Salt Lake City, for example, what sort of world is the system creating for you? How do you operate within that? So that's what I've been focusing on. To finally just really answer the question, what I focus on right now is mostly how the mergers and acquisitions market creates those possibilities, and also technology alliances. So the latter is particularly interesting just now because part of the alliance research focuses on pharmaceutical collaboration, and that's creating COVID-19 vaccines, for example. And how does that work? So,
well, and you mentioned mergers and acquisitions, Dr. Jennejohn. I know you've been involved in a lot of mergers and acquisition deals, some of them dealing with millions, if not billions of dollars. And earlier you mentioned the crippling power of poverty. But on the flip side, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the power of money and success.
Yeah, it's I've seen both sides of the coin where I've seen people take the success that they've had, whether it's monetary or other forms of excellence, and they've directed that towards creating social goods. And that's, and I think we can imagine examples just off the top of our heads. And that's a wonderful thing. I've also seen, and in my experience, it's just been more often, just the ethical and the moral compromises that people often make in the pursuit of what they view as success and what they consider to be power. So I'm pretty, as time has gone on, I've grown less and less enamored with it. And I think, it's one of the interesting things about teaching at BYU is an opportunity to share a different perspective, a different idea of what should motivate us as we pursue our goals, something beyond just, I want to make a lot of money. I want to control a lot of things, to actually creating things for society and for, there's that idea that I think we embrace at the university, which is just, humanity as a group of siblings and trying to help in that sense. So, Obviously the M&A market can be a tool for growth. It also, I think, growing up in a place like Wisconsin, which is part of the American Rust Belt, you also see situations where, the costs of the market are also present. What's good for shareholders isn't always good for employees, for example, or these communities that are affected. And I think it creates reasons for us to pause and think hard about what exactly are we really doing with ourselves.
Yeah. Well, and I love that reference to BYU and the teaching to treat everyone as family, as brothers and sisters, go forth to serve, right?
Yeah.
Which kind of leads me to my next question. You're a law school professor. And this last semester, I took a law school class. It's a requirement for business students, a business law class, and it got me thinking about going to law school, right? And I know I'm not the only person in that boat. I think a lot of my peers have kind of thought, law school kind of sounds cool. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the benefits of studying law and maybe who should consider going to law school.
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is law school can be right for everybody, and it's such a diverse institution, and not just BYU Law School, but every law school. It's a pretty shocking collection of intellectual areas. So for example, I do M&A work, and the Alliance, the Technology Alliance work that I do, I focus on private law. My colleagues just a few doors down focus on entirely different parts of the human experience, and use an entirely different toolkit. I basically leverage a lot of social science in my work, and they're focusing on entirely different areas of the law and of intellectual life. And I think what that means is everybody can find a place in law school, and at the same time, you're also going to be exposed to things that I don't think might have crossed your mind if you had gone into a graduate program with a really a narrow focus, which is how most graduate education works. So that, I think that just means that there's a broad base for everybody. Now, I'm going to focus a little bit more on like somebody who's interested in business, since that's sort of where this podcast is rooted, and that might be where a lot of the listeners are coming from.
Right.
So what I think is different, and I don't have an MBA and I don't teach in the MBA program, but this is just my third-party observations on what goes on there.
Sure.
We are going to teach you in law school, if you want to be a corporate lawyer, we're going to teach you a lot of the basic ideas and concepts that you encounter in an MBA program. What we're also going to couple that with, and I think actually a lot of MBA programs are trending this way also, but we're going to do, I think, a deeper dive on just the social benefits and the social costs that arise from the system, because part of what the law is supposed to be doing is really providing guardrails for the form of capitalism that we have here in the U.S., if we're just thinking about the U.S. right now. And it's going to emphasize the choices that we have as a society about different aspects of the system. So rather than just trying to train you, how to formulate and execute a great corporate strategy, we're going to think about that. And then we're also going to ask ourselves, okay, so to what extent should the law be supporting that process? And in what aspects should the law be constraining that? And so there's an element of I think social consequences that we emphasize in law school that I think, like I said, my impression is that it's not quite as front and center in maybe a business program. But maybe your listeners hear that and you're like, oh, that's totally wrong. And that would be an interesting thing to discuss. My misconceptions. So I think it's great. I think it's a great life. It is, maybe just one thing to tell people. There's the basic division within legal practice between litigators and transactional lawyers. And, litigators fight with each other in court and transactional lawyers do deals. And, there's stress on both sides. I think it is it is largely true that, one of the satisfactions of being a transactional lawyer is you're helping, kind of goes back to that creativity idea. You're helping people put something together to achieve some new goal. And disputes still arise, and maybe this disputes get so bad that you need to go to a court. It's not to say there's no contention within the process,
right?
But it is satisfying to sit back after a long deal runs its course and say, we made something happen, and something that didn't exist before is now on its way to fruition, and that can be a satisfying thing to do with your professional life.
Yeah, well, definitely. I loved hearing the way you described it, that through your practice, you're able to help others to create. And, I think there's going to be a need for that as we go forward. We talked about Elon Musk and I mean, talk about an example of dynamic, right? How much change he's bringing to the business environment. And he's a great example of some of these rapid technological advancements. I do think we're going to need laws and regulations to help us as we move forward in such a dynamic environment. So, yeah, I love that. So kind of a follow-up question is, so maybe a student doesn't go to law school, right?
Yeah.
I know you've worked a little bit with employment contracts and contracts in general.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to students as they move into their careers and are signing these employment contracts?
So, and this is where I just have to emphasize not legal advice. I'm not even a Utah lawyer. I'm a New York lawyer.
Right.
But generally speaking, 99% of the conversations I have, either with students or young professionals in this area, 99% of the conversations are about non-competes. So I try to negotiate the non-competes. The law is changing. There's a recent change in Utah law a couple of years ago that makes these more non-competes more employee friendly. There's some federal legislation that's working through Congress. If I'm remembering right, that would eliminate non-competes. But all, putting those developments aside, if you can negotiate the scope of that non-compete to reduce it as much as possible, that's usually what people are talking to me about. And it's, if you're going to a tech startup, I think there are some arguments that your employer might have about why they need to have a non-compete in place.
Sure.
My favorite example of this, though, about how ridiculous this can get is I teach first-year contracts, and we talk about non-competes one day. And I always ask my students, how many of you have signed a non-compete? And about 75% of the room raises their hand. And I always ask them, all right, so what sort of high-powered executives are you? And what are these non-competes you signed? And my favorite story was this student who raised his hand and said, well, I signed a non-compete when I worked at a bagel shop in Salt Lake City. And it was like, what sort of confidential information were you supposed to be hiding from any competitors? And he's like, I have no idea. I don't know why any of us signed that non-compete, but something about spreading cream cheese on bagels was highly specific to that employer.
Top secret.
Right. And I think, I think a lot of people just sign this stuff. I think some employers just throw this stuff out there as boilerplate contracting, like, oh, I guess you got to sign this and this and this. And one of them's a non-compete provision.
Right.
But this can be anti-competitive. I have friends who can't launch ventures in Utah or can't move to a new company here because there's a non-compete agreement in place with a really broad scope, both in terms of timing and substance. So that's my practical advice. I think the research is pretty strong that non-competes are by and large non-competitive, so anti-competitive. So that's what I got for you.
I love it.
More broadly, read the things. I mean, that might be the first place to start. Like, read the contracts you're signing, which not enough people do.
Especially the electronic ones. Definitely don't read through those.
No, right? I mean, it's perfectly rational. I'm not saying like anybody's stupid. I don't read my terms of service 90% of the time. But when you do, there's some pretty amazing things that you'll find in there sometimes. So, yeah.
I think that's great advice to read. And then especially once you've read, see if you can work down that non-compete within a reasonable scope. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So kind of to close things up, the name of our show is Measuring Success Right, kind of based off of Clayton Christensen's book on how will you measure your life. And so that's kind of how we like to close all of our interviews, is asking our guest, how have you come to measure success in your life? And I know you mentioned it earlier that it's important. You mentioned like, don't just chase the money. But I was wondering if we could maybe rehash that question a little bit more on what are the things that we should measure our life success on?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I have to confess, like it's been years since I've read Clay's book, which I thought was a great contribution. But so I don't know if I'm gonna repeat something he says. I can't remember. I mean, I think it's honestly important. However you measure this, I think there should be an emotional connection to some aspect of it. I think it's tempting to reduce this to sort of quantitative metrics, but I think part of this has to really speak to your heart. I think this could apply to somebody towards the end of their career, but especially those of you who are on the earlier end of your careers, I think you're going to encounter days. I encounter these days with some frequency where you have to ask yourself, like, what in the world am I doing this for? Like, this kind of sucks right now, for whatever reason. It's just really hard. And really why am I pushing through this? Why am I not, for example, a ski operator at the canyons right now? I would love to be skiing at the backcountry day and night. But instead I'm here. And I think it's important that you can draw on a notion of success that emotionally motivates you. So there are more articulate ways to put this, but I'll just again kind of just share a story that I had that also deals with my father. So he fought cancer for 13 years. During that period, just because of the situation, he certainly couldn't carry a job that he was qualified for just because of the treatment. So he had an MBA from Marquette University in Milwaukee. And when I was in high school, he was working the desk at a gas station in town, which, isn't really where you plan to end up as somebody with an MBA.
Right.
But he did that. He did that obviously for his family. And I would remember driving by, I was working part-time in high school. And I remember driving by in the middle of a Wisconsin winter, which is sort of that's an experience in and of itself. Driving by the gas station at night, it was dark, it was about 10 degrees outside, and just being able to see my father just sitting there behind the desk. Nobody happened to be at the gas station at that time. And just reflecting on the sacrifice that he was making. And I think, that kind of commitment, however people want to, put it into words, but it's that kind of commitment that I think we have to draw on. And I remember that. I try to take that into what I do for my children and for others, right? That we can. So I would say measuring success is about trying to build things for other people. I think the more you build things for other people, the more happy you'll be. The money and the financial security will come with that. I don't, sometimes it doesn't always work out the way you imagine, but usually working hard, I really believe that you work hard and the basics will fall into place. So, yeah. So that's my sort of rambling answer. I think building things for other people.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for that and for all of your insights. I know that's definitely touched me and will touch people in our audience too. So, I think maybe sometimes we look at law as a little bit too much of a black and white kind of concept. And, I love how you talked about how it can be used to create opportunities. It's not just the court cases, but it can be so much more in creating the world that we want to see. So thank you for sharing that. And of course, a huge thanks for joining us on the show this week. I also want to thank our audience for tuning in each week and supporting us. This has been another episode of Measuring Success Right. We hope everyone has a great week.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or SoundCloud so you never miss an episode. Be a friend and tell a friend about Measuring Success Right.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.